I don't know why. Okay, I'm letting people in now.
Okay. I do need screen share permission back though.
Okay. Hello, everybody. How are you guys?
Hello.
Hi,
Hi, Trina. Hi, Deborah. Good to see you guys.
nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay. Well, we're waiting for everybody else.
So we have two outcomes for today. First, we want to identify a framework for planning day-to-day learning in a distance setting, knowing that in many cases, your states or localities may have already provided you with that framework, but sometimes in our communication experience, we know that that framework isn't as explicit as it could be. So we do want to try and add to the conversation with some information that we have gleaned from the field as well. The second outcome is to exchange ideas for executing different portions of the lesson cycle in a distance setting. So the back end of the session, we're going to be really focused on a few different common strategies that many educators are trying in this new world that we find ourselves, and providing some best practices for them, but also, as we did last time we were together, to open up some opportunities for you to share some of your experiences or your thinking and reactions about how they might work best for you and how they have been working best for you so far. Our ground rules are these. We'll begin and end on time. So we are scheduled through 4, and we will keep you no later than that. We do want to make this an interactive session, just as we did last time, with the opportunity for you to jump in and ask questions and stay with the chat. So this will not be a sit and get for 45 minutes and then 15 minutes of questions. We will try and we do have many interactive opportunities planned, so please stay focused and be respectful here. As we're sharing our experiences, please know that everyone here has a positive intent. You're all taking time out of your Friday afternoon here to spend some time bettering your own understanding and exchanging ideas with others. And we're all here for that common purpose, to figure out how we can take this information and best serve our kids. So please keep that in mind as we're discussing with each other. We'll talk more about the chat feature for questions and responses in just a moment, but that's where we will ask you to record much of your thinking today. And please, would you mute your microphones when you are not speaking? That cuts out any background noise that might be distracting for those of us who are either presenting, in my case, or for those of us who are listening to the presentation at points in time. So a few housekeeping things. We appreciate back channel conversations. In a classroom or a more traditional PL setting, you try to discourage those conversations while the instruction is happening. But here we know what you're talking about because we can see it in the chat window. And so we can see that powerful learning tool. So this time you can be that kid that says, but I was talking about the lesson. And that's totally okay this time around. We appreciate that. And that's where we encourage you to make some meaning of what's being shared with you. As you participate in the chat, questions that you ask us will be tracked and responded to. We'll try to get them at a logical pausing point within the presentation here. We do have a few minutes blocked off for Q&A at the end, or in follow-up communications. If there is something that we can't get into inside the hour we have, we are committed to addressing those questions via follow-up emails afterward. And finally, we do want to make you aware that the chat will be saved, but that is only to allow us to follow up on those unanswered questions or comments, so we have a chance to go and say, well, who asked what, and what do they need from us, or how would they like to think together. It allows us to also, after the first session, to send out an email that says, hey, here's some of the big ideas that we shared, and more importantly, some of the big ideas that our partners shared, so we can capture that thinking and share that as so we all can share in the wealth of knowledge that we bring to the table here. That said, we do have a quick poll for you to start with our warm-up today. And this will launch the poll here in just a moment, and it'll give you an opportunity to respond. But we want you to think about this prompt. During the extended closure to date, my lesson planning has most resembled A, a puzzle trying to be fit together, B, a science experiment, C, the hammer, the blueprints, the building, or D, a bunch of scribbles. So please go ahead and respond to the poll as Anissa sets it up for us. And please go ahead and submit your response when you are able. And Anissa, when you see that we have a sufficient number of responses, are you able to share the poll with us, or do you want to talk a little bit about that data that our participants are sharing with you?
Pretty sure I can share it, so give me 1 second.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. So we see the jigsaw puzzle and the experiment carrying the day so far, along with some architectural plan, but some scribbling here as well. So I'd like us to take a moment to either in the chat or Anissa, if you'd like to open up the mic, I think either one is appropriate. For anyone who'd like to expand on their answer and why they selected that, I'm sure we'd all love to hear a little bit more about what you're thinking and that experience so far.
Well, this is Shamika. I picked the jigsaw puzzle because I feel as if we kind of know what things are going to be. We're here, we have pieces of the puzzle. We know kids need access to the internet. We know they need laptops. We have some sort of lesson plans and classroom set up. Now I just feel like, how are we going to put this all together and there to be in the best interest for them for distance learning?
Okay, so an understanding that there's pieces there, it's going to be putting the puzzle together on the fly to make it work best for us.
Yes.
Okay. What other thoughts are in the room?
I chose experiment here I'm Trina from Logan Hawking. We have limited internet and then we're trying all the Hangouts, and so we're just doing a lot of things we haven't done before. We're getting ready to do an online pilot with some elementary teachers. So I'm viewing that pilot as an experiment. So while I could have chosen maybe all of those, I feel like this is, for our district, is more of an experiment at this point.
Thank you. What other thoughts are out there? We'll hear from one or two more participants before to share their thinking before we go on.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Rush, and I'm actually a assistant principal for Pontiac Middle School. And I may be a little bold in saying that I think we're in the architectural plan, simply because our teachers are doing an awesome job. I see a lot of them are online here, putting everything into place that we've been talking about. Our district has been giving us some guidelines in terms of what it is that we need to do. So myself, as well as the principal, have definitely been channeling that information down to our teachers, who, again, we've been actually, as soon as they shut the schools down, our teachers were in service for learning how to do Google Classroom, and by the 16th had their lessons and everything going. Yes, we are puzzling things together as they go along, as one of our teachers shared, Ms. Roshan, but overall, I think we are doing an awesome job as a school.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's unique to hear an administrator's perspective here. So we do appreciate you being here and sharing the learning experience with your teachers, Ms. Rush, but also to share your own perspectives on this situation as well. Okay.
You're welcome.
Okay, so hopefully that got you to the intent there is to get you to reflect and share a little bit about your thinking and your experience so far. And not that any of these is the wrong place to be, right? In many cases, it is an experiment. No one has gone through this particular situation before. So there's an element of planning, there's an element of puzzling, there's an element of experimenting in all of the work that we're doing here. But hopefully being able to name that feeling or whatever it is that you're experiencing here as throughout the situation helps us to bring a little more clarity to what we know or what we feel like we don't know or how comfortable we are with planning the situation. That said, we do want to be mindful of sharing a framework for distance learning. And we know, as Principal Rush just stated, that some places are further ahead in the game in communicating expectations, and some places still have a while to go in trying to draft a plan to communicate it to teachers. And so we want to step into some of those gaps here if we can, provide some guidance that we've seen from various states, and just briefly discuss that as far as what a week of instruction might look like before we talk about some more practical strategies on how to execute that instruction. So again, we know that in many cases, your school boards or your state departments of education have issued guidance. For our Michigan folks, the guidance we're about to share should look pretty familiar for you. We know that our Oregon folks and Ohio folks have received varying levels of guidance, but we don't know, what maybe your school boards have offered too. So we do want to anchor our conversation there. So at the elementary level, because I know we do have a variety of folks that are joining us today, there's two possible schedules, and it really depends on the technology available to not only the school, but to the students in the community as well. For schools who are able to implement a mixed media approach, the numbers you see in that top row represent the maximum recommended number of minutes at the upper elementary level. So obviously, as you go down, those numbers will shrink a little bit. We don't necessarily want our pre-K students sitting in front of a computer screen or doing remote learning for several hours a day. That's difficult for them to manage. What we do want to note about that mixed media example, though, is that many states are recommending that additional offline enrichment work is possible and expected, 15 minutes a day or so. And the independent reading should an expectation. That's a wonderful learning opportunity. And that to the extent that we can promote and monitor that is certainly helpful at the elementary level. You'll see, though, that they don't get going across the top there, they don't get every subject every day. ELA and math has been the story since No Child Left Behind was passed, are the focus, right? With opportunities for contact with specials, for contact with science and social studies content as well as some opportunities for them to perhaps work on some extended projects as far as day might go. In districts with more limited technology, either at the district or at the within the communities who are using hard copy lessons or hard copy packets to facilitate student learning and enrichment, the teacher schedule might look very different, right? Where we might have office hours scheduled a few times a week, but there might be select days throughout the week for example, this schedule on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they were actively making contact with their students and checking in with them to see how they're doing with that enrichment work. So that is one way that some elementary schools have approached it. One way that different state departments of ed have approached that. These recommendations come from both Michigan Department of Education and the Illinois Department of Education. So we want to be mindful of that. We also know there's some secondary folks in the room as well. So if you indulge us for a moment, we'll talk some about a brief sample secondary schedule there, and we'll talk a little bit about some implications for teachers there. The first thing to point out, and again, when we looked at the elementary example, is this is very much what the students experience. It doesn't necessarily speak to how a teacher might structure their day. Instead, these are recommendations for how much time a student should spend with that particular content area on each day. And again, this is just one example, but it's one example that we felt comfortable sharing here. In mixed media or hard copy environments, so whether you are using technology to facilitate learning or you're using hard copy package to facilitate learning at that secondary level, again, there's recommendations that students are involved with their subject area learning about 30 minutes a day for, with emphasis on math, with equal exposure to math, science, ELA, as well, and social studies classes, so equal exposure to those 4 cores, but also some opportunities for electives. And we know for those schools with AP courses that AP courses are their own animal, and they require some regular student contact, especially with the AP exams bearing down on us rather soon, because College Board has not yet suspended those. That they may need some extra time to prepare. So it'd be helpful within our planning for student time and student exposure to be mindful of that as well. As a secondary level, we might also want to be mindful that students can work when we're not directly with them, right? So again, recommending that no more than 15 minutes per day of that work happens. And we should be encouraging independent reading at the secondary level as well. That is to say, so this is what a student might experience during this closure. Very absent from some of these recommendations is what the teacher workday might look like. And we felt it appropriate not necessarily to include an example here, simply because that's up to local context and how sites are able to manage communication and collaboration between and among staff. So certainly we would recommend that staff are able to hold office hours on some sort of rotating basis, so students have exposure to them for homework help, for those check-in opportunities. Certainly we would recommend that there are still opportunities for PLCs and subject matters to collaborate, subject area groups rather to collaborate. And certainly we would recommend that there is still room for staff meetings to occur, both for the social emotional check-in for the staff, but also to disseminate any new information and expectations that are there with that. But again, we didn't quite know how to visually represent that in a way that made sense given all the variables that go into that. But we still think that those are important elements to consider as we think about the teacher workday.
And Randy, to expand on that, I think it's all, where think about how you feel in having all of your cheese moved, and the kids are feeling that same way. So having that type of schedule where the school is thinking about how many minutes, depending on what the recommendations are, it's that sense of urgency both for us and for the kids. And we do have a schedule set up because you're just now launching it, going to be in another week or so. Definitely you think about how do you publish that schedule for both the students and the parents in as many ways as possible on the website, by email, by text, on a Google Classroom, in a flyer that's sent home, how that looks, that they know when they can reach you, and it's not a reach you 24/7, right? So that there's true office hours and you can have a sense of normalcy as well as that.
Thank you for adding to the thinking there. So if we have these recommendations for student time, whether that's 30 minutes roughly daily per subject area for secondary, or 15 to 30 minutes for our elementary folks, what could be done with that time? And I think that's the pressing question and one of the reasons that perhaps many of you have joined us today is trying to figure out, well, I know some things I could do, but how do I do them really well? What are some heavy hitters I could include in my arsenal? What are some things to think about as I build out the learning and design the learning? And that's where we want to spend some time thinking about. So one of those options you can spend with the time, and it doesn't have to be every time you have that block dedicated for your class, are these face-to-face meetings, these synchronous meetings that you're spending time in right now. And we do want to pay some attention to that and talk about some planning considerations here briefly in just a moment. But we also know that in many situations, for a variety of reasons, whether that's student availability or student access to technology or just their cognitive load in dealing with the stress of how the virus might be impacting their families or communities. We know that a lot of learning can't happen at the same time. We know we can't always get people around screens together. So a lot of learning has to be asynchronous. So there's a variety of examples we have down below: discussion boards, short or extended writings, responding to various stimuli, journaling, independent reading, recording and sharing and distributing lessons with students, and performance tasks. We won't be able to talk about all of those today in deep enough detail to do them justice, but we do want to focus on a few, namely discussion boards, journaling, and recording and distributing lessons, because that's where we have seen a lot of educators spending their time and energies. We want to give you a forum to spread some, share some, and indulge in some knowledge around those. The other practices are certainly part of upcoming lessons. We think it's important, especially if we're going to expect our elementary or secondary students to be doing some independent reading. The way we do independent reading has got to change a little bit in this new environment in terms of that monitoring thing. So we do have some future webinars planned for that, as a little bit of preview of what's coming on, and that'll be on our May calendar. But like I said, for today's focus and for the time we have available, we'll talk more about face-to-face meetings. We'll zero in on discussion boards, journaling, recording our lessons, and moving on from there. So first we want to talk about where you are now, these synchronous meetings. So many of you are in a spot where you are using Google Meets to facilitate classrooms, or Zoom, or WebEx, as the case may be, whatever the district has, or district or local body has decided for you. So we want to share a few things to think about as you design and plan those meetings for your class. What's helpful, and just as we tried to model at the beginning of our sessions here, is your students, especially if they haven't been in contact with you for a while, will need to reestablish some ground rules. Your students are not yet professionals like we are, so they will need some advice in managing the mute button and when it's appropriate for them to mute themselves or not. Or will you, depending on your comfort with the platform you're using, mute them all and not expect them to talk while you are sharing, and only ask them to talk at select points. That's a consideration for you. Again, how might you manage off-topic conversation and address that? If you are choosing not to have students muted, how will you redirect students if the case may be? Those are some management things you can think of. The other thing that is helpful to think about is a method for asking and answering questions. Nissy and I are fortunate enough to be paired together where one of us can sort of facilitate and the other sort of moderates, and the moderator's paying attention to some of the chats and back channeling and so on and so forth. And you may not have that luxury unless you are pairing with some of your partner teachers, and we've heard that happening at some different sites. So it'd be helpful to think about some different ways that you'll allow for that. You'll plan for those opportunities to happen. We also encourage you to be mindful of your time. Given some of the recommendations we shared earlier, and that students at home have a lot more things to be distracted by, they'll have much shorter attention spans than we might typically be used to, which means we need to have really short and tightly focused lessons and specific learning outcomes for each session. And not that wasn't part of our planning before, but if it wasn't elevated to the forefront now, at the end of that 10, 20, 30-minute virtual session, it's important that we have a specific focus for our kids. And in addition to that specific focus, we have to have a way to measure whether or not kids got what they should have from that lesson. So again, planning for formative assessment using tools like Socrative, using tools like Shobi. In the Google Classroom suite, you might use Google Forms. If you happen to be a Zoom or a WebEx user, there's polling options available as you participated in at the beginning of this session. So those are all different ways to do quick checks for understanding throughout. And finally, it'd be helpful, again, to communicate your care for students. If for the first time I've seen my students in a month or so, or whatever the distance might be, they still need to know that I'm a human and that I care about them. So you might ask them to stand alone and have a check-in question at the beginning of the session, like we did earlier today, to ask you a little bit about your mental state and concern around the planning. You might ask them to reflect as part of an assignment a little bit later on. But to be mindful about security and privacy for these sessions as well. We know that some districts have experienced a phenomenon called Zoom bombing, where unscrupulous individuals have figured out ways to kind of brute force their way into meetings if they aren't properly secured by locking the rooms or making sure they're limited to only registration. So part of setting up that environment to care, just like setting up a safe classroom, is being that gatekeeper for who can access and when. We don't have the time or space to necessarily talk about some of the security features of each platform we know our districts are using, but as professionals who might be supporting these synchronous meetings for the first time, it's important to reach out to our information technology staff or other experts in the building to help us be mindful of those security and privacy gatekeeping concerns as well.
And Randy, to build on that as well, communicating your care for students. One of the things I hadn't thought about, but somebody brought up in a webinar I was on earlier today was eye contact. So if you're using like Google Meets or Zoom like we're doing and you have camera on, how important it is to try to make that eye contact with other kids. For those of our kids that are remote, a lot of like things like Google Meets and Zoom and and all of those have a call-in feature. So the majority of our kids have a cell phone, or at least one that they can access, and they can at least call in and be part of the synchronous class, even if they don't have access to a tablet or Chromebook or laptop.
Thank you. Another strategy we want to dig a little bit deeper into when we might use synchronous meetings. Right now, they're being used as direct instruction, right? We're kind of sharing a lot of information with you, but they can be helpful throughout the learning cycle. One way we've seen them used is as that hook to the learning. So that 10-minute session might be, describing an interesting anecdote, or you having a conversation around an image that's related to the topic at hand that piques student interest and start some discussion around that. So the synchronous meeting doesn't have to be the direct instruction. It can be the gateway to instruction, where they might later have some readings or something to help them really get the material that you're asking them to master. Certainly, as it is right now, it can serve as direct instruction. It can also serve as guided practice, right? So in a math context, I might model how to solve problems and allow students to show what they're thinking in the chat or through a variety of formative assessment tools. We might also use this in independent practice, right? We could have synchronous meetings, but with small groups of students. So an opportunity for those small groups of students, those 4 or 5 students to come in and share, present, critique some of their work. Synchronous in this setting means synchronous for that small group of students, but not necessarily for the large group. It'd be akin to sort of a guided reading group that you might have at the elementary level as well. Synchronous meetings might be a vehicle for that if you're able to schedule that. And certainly these get-togethers don't have to happen at the beginning of the learning. They can happen at the end, right? Particularly at the end of a writing unit or at the end of a lengthy writing assignment. If we were able to come together and have a brief class discussion around what we learned and how that activity went for us and facilitate some reflection there, that would be another helpful way to use these meetings. So it doesn't always have to be straight lecture, right? It can be, the synchronous meetings can be a tool for class discussion and collaboration as well. We want to talk about one more strategy before we give you an opportunity to pause and share some thinking with us, and that is discussion boards. For those of you who have participated in online learning on your own, you may or may not have had a successful experience with that. So we do want to share a few practices that can make those discussion boards more effective and really drive student engagement and learning through the use of those discussion boards. So first, we'd want to develop a prompt. That prompt might stand on its own, independent of anything else. So it might be an open-ended question, like at the beginning of the learning, tell me what you know about X, Y, or Z, or share your feelings about this topic. But we might also have a stimulus accompanied by that prompt as well. So we might give them a short video to respond to and share their thinking about, or an image or a graph or a chart that really gets the conversation going. Something with enough depth for them to be able to analyze and have some debate or some conversation about what that data means and how they might interpret it. Once we've decided what prompt we're going to design for them, we want to have some guidelines for them to respond to that. Some of those guidelines might include length guidelines. So often we've seen teachers recommend a word count, so a 250 word count, for example, in that initial response. You might include, expectations depending on the style of question that students cite evidence in their responses. And you might establish a guideline for frequency, right? So you might post one question at the beginning of the week, but ask them to check into the discussion board a few times throughout to see how their thinking has changed. As we talk about some of those guidelines for responses, what that makes me think of is a rubric. And that might be a helpful tool that would be, you could use again and again, right? So if you have your discussion board you're using at one point, you know, at this week, and you don't have a discussion, you have a discussion board next week and the next week, the same rubric could, in theory, work for all of those, depending on the purpose of those questions. The beauty of discussion boards, though, is they allow for student-to-student interaction. So we need to plan and communicate some expectations to our kids for that. So how many other students should our students respond to? In some cases, is that 2? Is that 3? Is that 4? How often should they be interacting with other peers? Do we have an expectation that students reply to the replies on their own post? So do we just let a reply hang out there, or should there be some evidence that I did something with the thinking that a peer shared with me? And again, do we have any expectations of length of those replies? So one pitfall is that if that length expectation is missing, sometimes we get simple replies like, I liked it, or it was good, or I disagree, which don't really add to the conversation and are sometimes, you know, kind of not worth the time for us to look in and not worth the time for the student to put in. So the more guidelines we can put in about what a successful and high quality response looks like, the better. And to spur some of that conversation, what can be helpful is sentence stems. So I like, I wonder feedback, or tell, ask, give feedback, where a student tells something they like, they ask a question, and then they give a suggestion about how the work or the response might be improved upon. So the same sentence stems you might use for student-to-student feedback in a live classroom setting would be helpful, but also certainly applicable in discussion board setting as well. The last thing to consider about discussion boards is your role as the teacher. Will you serve simply as the moderator? So will you watch it like a hawk to really just, you know, watch out for problematic speech or potential conflicts and dig in to that? Depending on your learning management system, you might have to approve each post as it's made on the discussion board, and that's certainly an option. And you might want to consider your role as an active participant. So will you be one of those people replying to students to push thinking, or is your expectation that you're going to sit more on the sidelines? And if so, why in that case? So exploring some of your own rationale for how you choose to interact with students in that case. Discussion boards are useful certainly throughout the learning cycle. Certainly if we provide that interesting hook, that question, that graph, that chart, that media, gives students something to talk about. So it's certainly helpful to use that as the hook. If it's more of an extended stimulus, like a text of some sort that we're asking them to engage with, they can certainly respond and make their thinking visible about this text. I think this was a good text, or I think the author had a good argument because X, Y, and Z. And ask for a little bit more meat in those responses to stimulate some of that new learning. In guided practice, we can use them, again, as a check for understanding of what students know, especially when the concept requires some significant explanation or justification using evidence, or so on and so forth. So it's really an opportunity for students to have some lengthy responses in these discussion boards. In independent practice settings, an opportunity for them to, again, collaborate and critique. Again, the response features and whatever expectations we put in place around that can be super helpful for that collaboration, helping students to refine their work to make it the best it can be. And again, as a closure, right? So this might happen at the end of the learning cycle for an opportunity for us to say, so what did you learn today? And give me a quick summary of that, but also ask students to build on some of those and ask some probing questions to really make sure that everyone's got the meat of that lesson, the meat of that learning target under their belts. So we'll ask you to pause for a minute. We know I've been talking for a while and this has been chiming in, but I want to give your brains a break for a brief moment and get you shifting gears and thinking about what we've heard so far. And so please feel free to respond to these in the chat. What's been discussed so far that seems similar to what you already know and do? And what seems different from what you already know and do? And just take a few moments to drop some thinking in the chat for us, and we'll respond to and call on a few of you to lift some ideas as they come up. So Anissa, what are you seeing in chat so far that's coming to the surface for you?
So one of the things is Anna had mentioned that they're using class to post discussion, to post this. Let me try that again. Using classmates' names when they're making connections from one, pulling from one student and responding to that is really a great way to help build that class culture and community. And one other way to try to acknowledge students. So trying to get them to do that. There's also, it to them. And definitely discussion boards are a new concept, but it's a different platform, but a way to still have the kids talk to each other and have that interaction, which is so cool.
I did see some questions about whether this is a function of Google Classroom. Yes, in a sort of a roundabout way in the stream, you can post a prompt and have students respond to that. It's not as in your face as it might be in other learning management systems like Blackboard or Schoology or so on and so forth. So the concept is the same. The application or the implementation is a little bit different as you explore the software you have available to you. So that's certainly, so the answer is yes, Destiny, but it really depends on what system you're using. But generally the feature and the practice can be used anywhere. Okay, being mindful of the time, and we thank you for sharing your thinking so far. We do want to discuss, share two more strategies with you that might be helpful in this new world we find ourselves in. Then we'll have time for a more open and robust question and answer session here toward the end. So we'll go ahead and press forward, but please keep back channeling and Anissa, as you are seeing questions or comments or comment themes in the chat, please let me know.
Yeah.
One other thing that we know a lot of educators we're working with is, educators we work with are planning on is recording their lessons and doing, recording some lectures or other parts of a lesson to really get students involved and to give them some of that teacher contact without actually meeting them at the same time. So this is the flip side of the synchronous meetings. As we think about what it might mean to record some lessons, some effective practices to keep in mind are, again, you're going to have shorter attention spans. And I hate to say this, but you will never compete with all of the other stimuli that students have in their homes. So whatever we've got has got to be short and sweet and really to the point and really focused on a learning objective. And that learning objective has got to be clear. So by the end of this lesson, you will know how to add two-digit numbers. Or whatever the learning objective might be, and it's got to be that short and that snippy to really take advantage of the sustained attention that students are able to give us during this time. So that is the first thing we'd encourage you to do. I don't know that many students will have the bandwidth, either internet bandwidth or the mental bandwidth to sit through more than a 10 or 15-minute recorded lesson. Simply because that's the world we live in now. And I think in your classrooms, you've probably experienced that to some degrees. So please, we would encourage you to be mindful of that time and try to keep that short and sweet as possible. One thing that's helpful though is make your thinking visible and providing some clear and thorough examples or non-examples or next steps. So if I'm thinking a mathematic concept, I might provide examples of different ways to solve a problem and also some ways not to solve that problem, right? Some common errors. So they have an opportunity to see what experts think as they're solving this, as they're approaching this new learning. In an ELA context, I might, be expressing my thinking about grammar rules, or I might be doing a read aloud for my students and really showing them how I'm interacting with the text and making that thinking visible. In any of those contexts, we're making that thinking visible and really letting students know what it is that we as the experts in the field are doing And that's a good practice for, when we return to normal as well, but certainly during these recorded lessons, we should be modeling for kids what we as the experts in the field do. Lastly, though, it's one thing to have a video. It's another thing for kids to have them watch it, but it's another thing altogether for them to be able to do something with that video. So please do plan for formative assessment and feedback as you are recording those lessons and thinking about those things. So one platform that came up in the last time we talked, for those of you here that were here last time we talked, was Edpuzzle. And that, for those of you that may not be familiar, it is another online app that allows you to import any video from YouTube or any other video source. It allows you to plug in questions here and there to make sure students are still there, still with you, but also to B, check for understanding of concepts. Those can be either multiple choice questions or open-ended responses. So it gives you an opportunity to really see whether or not students understand whatever it is that's in that video. You might also develop a Google form quiz. I know several of our schools are Google Classroom schools, and quizzes is a feature native to that. If you use Blackboard or Schoology or something else, there are other quiz features there that you might also assign as a companion to that, right? A companion to that recorded lesson. So students have an opportunity to show what they know right away. It gives you an opportunity to give them some feedback as well and send a quick note saying, hey, I saw you didn't really get this. What can I do to help? Or here's some potential next steps to really make that work for you. So again, really parallel to what we might do in the classroom, just in a different media than we're used to.
And Randy, one of the things that I was just talking with the teacher about earlier today was the concern that she's trying to do like flipped learning, so making videos, and she was concerned about, well, the low-tech kids, how do we get it to them? And the one thing that we talked about was the fact that sending the link via email, text, having a private professional YouTube account where the kids can access it that way on their phone, were some of the ways that she was thinking about how to get the word out if the kids did have immediate access to the Google Classroom that she had set up. So again, just thinking about those different avenues to try to get material that the kids can use on their phone if they don't have access.
Mm-hmm. One other solution we've seen to that particular problem, right? Even if phone access is an issue, is if there are several teachers who are recording lessons or something throughout the week and they're able to compile them in one central place and get them on a thumb drive to distribute to students at food distribution sites or whatnot, that's another option as well. That is a logistical beast in and of itself, and that is certainly something we're happy to think with you together on outside this particular session. But that's definitely a solution we've seen, and a solution for any learning material for that matter, whether that's worksheets, reading, so on and so forth. Distributing thumb drives, while it's not the most time-friendly solution, it is another way to get those students some teacher contact, so to speak, even though it's not at the same time, but also to get them materials as well. So where does recording lessons fit throughout the learning cycle? It fits a few different places. At a hook, if I'm at the hook, so at the outset, if I want to have an interesting picture or video that I want to show them how I'm thinking through that and really get them interested in how experts might solve a particular problem or how experts are interpreting a particular historical artifact. Certainly you might record, as we alluded to earlier, a math lecture as direct instruction, showing examples of how to solve particular problems and implement particular concepts, or showing them how to graph, or so on and so forth. In a guided practice setting, certainly once students have submitted some work, recording lessons is a great way to give feedback to your students. So after students have submitted an essay or a math problem exercise set, or their a lab set if they're able to do labs out in their home environments, the recorded lesson or recorded discussion, if you will, is a great opportunity for us to give some feedback and give them some examples and non-examples and some other things for them to consider to give them that recipe for future action. And certainly can be used at the closure, right? Once they've submitted final products, we might take it upon ourselves to summarize some of the learning that they have done and highlight some of the accomplishments they've made throughout that learning And, use it as an opportunity to connect with kids again and give them that shout out within the space of that recorded lesson or that recorded session. The final strategy we want to spend some time with here today before we decompress here and let you give you an opportunity to share some more thinking is journaling. And it's a concept that you have that exists definitely in a lot of classrooms right now, but probably needs a tweak or two to work in this new world we find ourselves in. But just as you would do now, develop a prompt or a series of prompts which are aligned to your learning targets. Learning targets in this case could mean a focus on SEL. Certainly checking in with our students and making sure that they're okay is a valid learning target at this time, just as it is at any other point in the year. We could ask them, send them home with a few videos if we're using that thumb drive solution or packets or packets or otherwise to give them a few things to think about and respond to. We could ask them some metacognitive or reflective prompts for them to respond to as well. So how did that activity go for you? What did you learn from this? What part of the procedure seemed to be most difficult for you? And asking those sorts of reflective questions. And of course, we might ask students to engage in free writes as well. Certainly not all the time, because that might detract from the overall value of the journal, but certainly giving space for students to write about what is of most interest and most pressing to them can be helpful, especially at this time. Again, we want to think about developing and communicating expectations for their responses. So things like length, things like focus skills. So if they're responding to a particular stimuli or set of stimuli, are they citing evidence? If they're writing freely, or even if they're doing their own self-reflection, do we want them thinking about introductions or transition skills or so on and so forth? And other measures of quality of writing that might be helpful. So if your school uses, for example, the 6+1, Lucy Calkins 6+1 traits as a writing rubric, it might be helpful to think about voice and other dimensions here that would be helpful to give students some feedback on what their writing looks like in this more informal setting. Unfortunately, though, we can't just have our students drop their journals in the milk crate at the end of the day and check in with that. So we needed to devise some ways to get a hold of what they're thinking and get them some feedback on that. So it might be that they have a Google Doc that they're submitting into a particular assignment link in your learning management system, whatever that happens to be. For students without regular internet access, but they're still able to get it sometimes, it might be that they're just submitting photos or emailing or texting an image of what they're writing about to you in whatever way they can get that to you. Some schools have also, where they're able to, they've gotten each student 2 journals. Or have students get 2 journals or 2 composition notebooks that they trade off at food distribution sites where teachers have the opportunity to access them and provide some feedback that way. So that's another way to support, rather a variety of ways to support our students at a variety of levels of technology access with this particular practice. Journaling, like all the other strategies we've talked about, has a spot in lots of places throughout the learning cycle. Certainly as the hook, if we've got something for them to think about, well, tell me what you're thinking. Through new learning, if we provide them with a text or something, or a video, something of some length or substance to read or interact with, they can certainly either summarize that, but also reflect and do some metacognition how it fits with they already knew. This makes me connect to this other thing because, or I see a relationship between this and this. They might also tell us how they don't see a connection, and that might be valuable for us to know as teachers if they're not feeling that this is something that they're seeing a connection with. In guided practice, certainly journaling can work as a check for understanding, similar to a discussion board, right, where they have an opportunity to write more about what they're experiencing, what they know, what their explanations and justifications are for their responses. For independent practice, again, it's another opportunity for them to write on their own, especially if they have a hard copy notebook they're writing. That's very independent practice at that point. And certainly as the closure at the end of the learning, it's an opportunity to summarize learning and again reflect on what worked and what didn't go. So what did you learn about this? Or what parts didn't go so well? Or what did you do really well? And what can we take from this experience that you could take to the next time we have a similar problem? And exploring that, some of that kind of reflection and metacognition could be really powerful, especially at this time, given the limited time, contact time we have with our students. So we've done a lot of thinking, and we've shared 4 strategies here with you today. And we want to try and give you a chance to bring that all together and think about this prompt here. We'll ask you to first respond to that in chat, and then Anissa to ask a few folks to elaborate where they can. So the question is this: the learning cycle has been discussed after the introduction of each strategy we've talked about here. What are some of the reasons that the learning cycle, or what might be some of the reasons that learning cycle was emphasized as part of this webinar? Why did we keep coming back to that over and over again? Please take a few moments to drop in some thoughts in the chat. And Anissa, as you see some responses, please feel free to either synthesize those or call on some other folks.
Destiny, I think you bring up an important part. It's like following the formula, right? This is brand new in terms of the basic. The foundation is the same. We want to make sure that we've got the basic parts of the learning and try to make it as interactive and engaging for the kids as possible. That doesn't change. It's just the how, the platform. How do we get it to the kids, and how do we get it back to the kids that looks a little different? So great bringing that forward. And if anybody else wants to say out loud, they can. You guys should be able to unmute yourself.
Lots of great ideas provided today. Thank you.
No problem. And Michael, it's a good way to think about it as well, a path to follow. Okay, so Randy, just looking at our time.
I'm aware of that. So I do want to give a thank you for your time and thinking here today. I do want to make some space for Q&A, but for those of you who are really pressed and need to be somewhere at 4 o'clock, I want to give you a few pointers on how we can wrap up the day and how we can best help you from here on out. So first things first, we would ask you to give us a little bit of help and let us know how this session is meeting your needs, or how these sessions are meeting your needs or not. So very shortly, if not already there should be a link to a feedback survey in your email addresses or in your email inboxes for you to drop some thinking for us. Your submitting those feedback surveys allows us to track your attendance and allows us to give you a printed certificate in June if your PL hours required, depending on your state. So we can say, yes, you spent 5 hours with us, go do with that whatever you need to. One thing the exit ticket does ask you though is, or the survey does ask you for, is a little bit of an exit ticket. Just to confirm your attendance today, and that is, we ask you today to think about 2 different prompts. First, what are some things you are hopeful about after today's discussion? And second, what might you be hesitant about? What is still not quite sitting right with you just at the moment? So for those of you that must go, please check your emails and please let us know how we're doing. If you have some questions that you would like to discuss a little bit further, please do stick around, and Anissa and I are happy to answer those as we can.
Again, I just want to say thank you, Anessa and Randy. You guys did an awesome job. I will be sharing some of these ideas with our staff, the ones that could not make it, and keep up the great work.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Thanks, Cynthia. I appreciate that. And just let us know if there's anything we can do to help support.
Definitely. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
You guys know
Bye-bye.
my favorite, so is everybody else on here.
Oh, okay.
Just kidding.
Have a good one.
You too.
No problem. Thanks. You too. Thanks, guys. We appreciate everybody. Look for the email.
Okay, goodbye.